Okay, so if you've been following the Ultimate ZX Spectrum video I did, there's a little bit of an update to that. And basically, as you can see, probably just over there, there's a working Spectrum in a DK-Tronics case, but the case is different. It's got a full-size spacebar on this one. That's because the model you saw in the previous video failed. It failed within probably 15 minutes after literally making the video. It just turns out that these machines are getting old. They're starting to fail. They fail at a drop of a hat because they're 35 to 40 years old now, and it seems a bit odd that we expect them to carry on working, or people do anyway, and they don't, because parts age, chips age, capacitors age, and they start to fail. Now, as I said before, the DK-Tronics stuff is really good. I mean, it's very well built, and the actual keyboard and the joystick port, which I thought originally the joystick port caused the crash because I was busy just playing a little game on it. I was actually using Manic Miner, and I thought I'd have 10 minutes on it, and within sort of 5 or 6 minutes of using it with the joystick, it crashed. So I disconnected the joystick, had a look, but it was still completely wiped out. No display, no nothing. So it got me thinking that the peripherals seem much better built than the original kit, and in the case of the Sinclair products, that seems to be the way it is, because if you know a little bit of history about Clive Sinclair, he kind of used components that were faulty to start off with. His memory chips, he bought them because they weren't up to spec, so he used them and utilized them to make a 16 or a 48K Spectrum. He basically used their good bits of the chips and the components to make it work, which is great, which he did all the way along. He did it with making radios, he did it with making everything that he actually ever did. It was always repurposing failed or components that weren't up to spec. Brilliant idea. So I don't know why we expect the machines to last as long as they did if they're already built with inherently faulty components. And it's not just Clive Sinclair. Commodore did it. They did it with a lot of their chip fabrication that they actually did, where they made mistakes and they did workarounds, or the chips didn't actually work, so they ground out the substrate so they would work. And it was the way of the world, because why spend twice as much money on the components that you need if you can save it by utilizing tens of thousands of faulty components that the original manufacturer said weren't up to spec for what they needed. And it's we shouldn't expect these machines to carry on working in the way they have been. In the case of Sinclair, though, they seem to have more problems than most. Seems to be Sinclair and Texas, which I'll come to on another video. But what I'm going to do is do a strip down and a repair of your ZX Spectrum in a future video to find out what exactly goes wrong with them, how to test it and so on, and then find the cure. But what I have found, that certain components in these machines, and it's not just Sinclair, it's most of them, especially ones that use a ULA, because it was fairly new. You got to remember, it was fairly new at the time when the ZX Spectrum came out, because I think the ZX81 was one of the first machines that Ferranti kind of manufactured ULAs for, the parts for them, and it was all fairly new. In fact, processor technology was still quite new when these micros were coming out. Now, the amount of failures that are coming into the system for ULA failures, especially on the Sinclair stuff, is because they're actually decomposing or degrading inside of their casings. ULAs on Spectrums do have a habit of going deaf, so aren't you aren't able to load anything from a cassette tape and software into the machines. They also have a habit of just failing altogether and screwing up your video display and so on, which is, all part of bringing in hundreds of transistors rather into a ULA. Hundreds of transistors, which then could have been independent ICs, but they actually made them into a ULA. And it's just part of the course. These machines are getting older, they're suffering, and things like mechanical keyboards, which I'm quite a big fan of because they do tend to feel better and last longer, but they actually have problems where if they're not used, the contacts start oxidizing and then they don't work very well, or they give up working altogether. The other keyboards, which have a membrane which is backed onto a sort of a rubber or a foam backing to provide the bounce for the keys, well, that starts breaking up and degrading. The insulation foam that they use between components and casings and that just turns to powder. And all of these machines are starting to really show that they're not going to last forever. So I think while we've got them working and while we have them and while we can still get parts for them or scavenge parts from dead machines, it's a good idea to try and keep as many running as possible. But you got to think that when you are buying one, make sure that the prices for these machines aren't overinflated, because they tend to be now, especially on eBay, they're overinflating the price for retro machines or classic computers. Even old PCs now are being hiked up in price, which is okay if you can keep them running or keep the parts supply going, but the part supply is drying up. So I think we need to, if you're a collector of these machines, make a little bit of a stand to say that no, we're not going to pay over the odds for these machines, because we know even having them shipped, they could not work at the other end, or they could work for 10 minutes once you buy it, and then you're going to have to spend the next 3 or 4 months sourcing parts, components, and tracing the fault. So need to get a little bit more of a common sense route for people who are buying these machines, because they're not going to last. They've lasted 35, 40 years in some cases, which is way beyond what anybody envisaged that they were going to last. The Spectrum that I used in this case, it was probably spent its first year being hammered by the first kid who got it. Then the next year it was probably passed on when he upgraded his machine, and then hammered by his brother or a friend who bought the machine. And then it probably spent the next 30 years forgotten in a dusty attic or cupboard. So they've had quite a hard life, and time is not going to do them any good, the passing of time. So what I'm going to do is start doing videos on repairing them and the basic faults initially, and then more in-depth faults as well, and more in-depth technical videos as well to help people out. But I'm quite lucky that I've got a number of spares, and I'm able to trace down the faults and fix them and repair them and solder them, but not everybody is. So you got to bear that in mind if you're going to collect these machines, that maybe you need to get something that's a bit more popular so you can readily get the parts for them, and you're not going to struggle, and you're not going to be that upset if it does fail in a massive way and you have to either try and get another working machine or try and get a semi-working machine where you can swap the boards out or swap the processors out and so on. So it's just one of those things, part and parcel of anything that's old, it's going to fail. Studies recently have shown that processors do actually slow down through age. CPUs slow down with age. Memory actually weighs more as it fills up with data. SD cards do the same. So there's always going to be wear and tear, even though they were touted as reliable, non-moving parts, you know, nothing to wear out, but that's not quite true, because, you know, time and the elements and the way they were stored has a massive effect on whether they're going to last or they're not going to last. But as you can see, my little ultimate ZX Spectrum has kind of evolved again, which I'm sure it's going to evolve again and again and again until, you know, we get to where we finally want with them, if we ever do. But, you know, the amount of Sinclair Spectrum Pluses that you see with keyboard faults, because the membrane's failing and the rubber in between the membranes failing. So, and they're not the only ones. Atari STs, which I've got quite a number of, the keyboards just feel dead now. Even the best ones feel quite dead, because the rubber's starting to fail. You know, the cases are getting brittle. They're eventually going to, you know, they're going to disintegrate, and you're going to have to re-engineer the hardware into something else to keep it going. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a brief update on how it was and how the machines went, but, you know, that's just the way it is. Just the way it is. So be prepared for some jubilation, some heartache and some frustration when you get into all of these old classic machines. Okay, thanks a lot for listening, and, you know, if you get time and you like what you've seen, just subscribe, and you know, so we can keep you updated with anything else that comes out. Okay, thanks a lot.